Paul Cashmere, welcome to Australian Musician.
And thank you, Greg.
Tell me about the young Paul Cashmere, the young teen. What kind of albums were you buying? What sort of concerts were you going to?
Oh, look, I was a kid of the 70s, so, it was still very much the Beatles, Stones, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin era. Then along came bands like Slade, very much my era, Status Quo, showing my age, no doubt. And then I guess it was around 1975, 76 where I was allowed to go to shows. Unfortunately, the very first concert that I ever got to see was Gary Glitter. But Sherbet were on that bill, so was Jeff St John. It was, like a big show in Sydney for 2SM. Back in the early 70s, and I think the first paid show I ever went to was probably Alice Cooper at Randwick Racecourse in 1977, and probably pretty much seen every Alice tour since then.
When did you start taking notice of music media, and who were the radio announcers, music writers that you were sort of reading or listening to?
I grew up in Sydney, so the radio station that everybody my age listened to back then was 2SM. That was filled with some great DJs. Ian McRae doing Breakfast, Ronnie Sparks doing Drive, and then in 1975, I think was when 2JJ came along, and that really broke up the Sydney radio market. That was 2JJ as opposed to Double J as we know now as the National Digital Network. So it was an AM radio station in Sydney only, but what they did, they took the American AOR format, the album-orientated rock format, and we were suddenly getting really alternate acts on the radio like Linda Ronstadt, Roxy Music, Brian Ferry, Jackson Brown. It's amazing that they were the alternative acts of 1974, 1975, and it took a format such as that for them to break through to the mainstream. So, that was sort of the makeup of where I was with media at that time. And of course, in print you had RAM, you had Go Set, and, if you get your hands on an American Rolling Stone magazine, of course that was a bit of a win, but from a local media print perspective, definitely Go Set and RAM.
And your entry point into radio, what was that?
1975, I started off at the Max Rowley Radio School. So I'd finished school and decided that I was going to get into radio, and there was a training course in Sydney at the time, the Max Rowley Radio School. I did that for about 18 months and then scored a job at 2AD Armidale in New South Wales 1 week before Elvis Presley died. So I got to play Elvis Presley on the radio as not only a living person, but also a hit, because he had a hit at the time called Moody Blue and Way Down, both in the top 40 that week that I started on radio. So that was it's always been noted.
So where did your radio journey take you from there?
From radio, I went through a series of radio stations on air and gradually worked my way into management. The management gig first sort of happened, I think, around 1987. So from 2AD I went to 2ST in Nowra, to 2NM in Muswellbrook, to Eon FM, which is now Triple M, and then over to Fox for a very short time, and then to 2WL in Wollongong, which was actually owned by the Macquarie Network, and it was a very high rating and well-respected radio station at the time. Working at that radio station, I became music director and then program director. The station was then taken over by Mark Day, who owned The Truth in Melbourne, and he owned the Sky Radio Network. At that point, so I became the program director of the Sky Radio Network and went around the country looking after all of his radio stations at that point. That's when I hit the Austereo radar. They hired me, brought me down to Melbourne, and that's where I've been ever since.
And what are your fondest memories of radio days?
Oh, radio days back in the 1980s was no expense spared. I remember the big record launches. When John Farnham Whispering Jack, followed by Age of Reason, came out, and the massive parties that they were having in Sydney for things like that. The access to artists, I guess there was such a small amount of media in Australia at the time where, I remember in 1987, 88, whenever that solo Mick Jagger tour was, getting a call from CBS Records, which is now Sony, that morning. I was working in Wollongong at the time, saying, hey, do you want to come up to Sydney for lunch today? We're doing a thing with Mick Jagger, and bring your tape recorder, we can sit down with him and you can ask him whatever you want. So they were the sort of things that we had access to go to. So many great concerts that were coming through then, because you still had bands like Dire Straits were still together. The first Neil Young and Crazy Horse tour, 1985, at the Sydney Entertainment Centre for me. That first time Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band came to Australia. Van Morrison, there were so many great acts that we look back on now, and some of them still are around, some aren't. So I was very, very lucky and privileged working in the position that I was, to be able to not only talk to a lot of people but also to get to see them live in the peak of their careers.
Tell me about the transition from radio to online media.
The transition from radio to online happened very naturally for me, because I'd done the on-air radio thing, which progressed into management, as I mentioned, through Mark Day's 2WL, into coming down to Melbourne and working for Austereo. My position at Austereo was National Program Director for Austereo Entertainment, so I looked after all of the national shows. At the time they had things like Rock 40, all the party hard shows, the home free shows, they all came through me, all produced out of Melbourne, and all went to, I think it was something like 82 radio stations around the country. So that got me into the management side of things. At that point I was designing radio shows specifically for the Austereo network, and designed a radio show that they didn't pick up called Undercover, and that was going to be a national radio album show that could go across the network. They didn't like the idea, and I pretty much didn't like them at that point either, so we just split, and I went off and started that first digital magazine in Australia, Undercover. So undercover.com.au was without a doubt the very first digital music magazine in Australia, and possibly the world. We produced that onto CD-ROM. It was distributed to 27 countries around the world, and without a doubt that was the first digital music magazine anywhere else in the world, so that was quite a proud moment.
And going from Undercover to Noise 11.
Undercover became a very successful online magazine once we stopped doing the digital CD. It became the home of Yahoo Australia, AOL Australia, Coca-Cola were using it as the source of their music content. So it sort of set up a syndication model that we then took into the 21st century. That took me into a company that wanted to go public at the time called Whoopee, but it didn't quite get there. Many of you will remember the whole dot-com crash of around 2000, 2001. That tended to wipe out those plans. I took back the company at that point until we went into a company called Roo Media. Roo Media was a New York-based digital company that needed a music or entertainment-based platform to then progress with where it needed to go. And that's when I went into Roo, and Undercover went into Roo, and then it took on a progression of basically public companies for the remainder of its years, until I'd moved on, decided I wanted more of the family business to be operating instead of being involved with a big multinational company, and that's when Noise 11 started.
We can't mention Noise 11 or in fact Undercover without mentioning Roz Gorman, your photographer and partner in crime, your lovely wife. Mm-hmm. Tell me about her contribution to the media.
When we started Undercover, Roz and I very much envisaged that as being a family business. We had the two kids at school at the time that were sort of showing a real interest in music. And, you know, like anything, when you start off with your own business, you start off lean and mean. So, you know, we had the husband, the mother, the son, the daughter, and I think we even put the dog in there for credits for some things at some point, just to make us sound like we were a little bit bigger. So Roz really looked after the entire management of what was happening with the digital media business, and that gave me the room to look after the content. So it was a very even partnership. She had also developed a love of photography and got involved with taking photos. She would then go out to concerts that we were reviewing and get in the pit and take photos of the artists that were coming to town at the time. So we built up a massive collection of catalogue of original content that she has taken with everybody from local bands like British India all the way through to Rolling Stones and AC/DC. Roz looked after the day-to-day of everything that happened with Undercover and then into Noise 11, and she's absolutely, I cannot tell you how much we miss her.
We did lose Roz in 2018. I think something that came out of that, and something that I've come across, is the power and closeness of the Melbourne music community. Tell me about that.
When Roz passed away, and it was very sudden for us, we'd only had 6 weeks' notice that she had cancer, so it was very, very quick. From the time that she found out to when she left us. And I think, you can imagine the shock that that has on any family. But the outpouring that came out of the friends and family and the music industry was just overwhelming. The love that was felt, and we all felt within the family for her passing, and still do, because, to this day, you're mentioning it here right now. And, when I see photos pop up of, memories, it might be something that, a concert we attended, that pops up on social media. Every single day there's reminders of the work that she did and the love that the community had for her. And it was just such a touching thing when we had the farewell for her at the Corner Hotel. The number of people that came along from all facets of family, friends and industry. And also, the work that she did within the State Emergency Services, SES. I was really touched on the night that we had the farewell for Roz at the Corner Hotel, how those two worlds of hers came together for the very first time. And the number of people that told me from SES they had no idea about what she did in the music industry, and people from the music industry going, we had no idea what she was doing for SES, was, again, it was just remarkable, and just a wonderful thing to see, and wonderful memories for me and the family to have.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of your more memorable interviews, starting off with the more positive ones, the ones you've enjoyed.
Well, the biggest interview that I've ever had was with George Harrison. That was just an incredible moment. I was still working at Austereo at the time that interview came through, and I remember the phone ringing. The interview was about 11 o'clock at night. I was sitting in a studio waiting for that call to come through, and it was late, and it was getting later, and it was getting later again. Then suddenly the phone rings, and I answer the phone, and I get this English Liverpudlian accent, as everybody knows. They can picture his voice as I'm saying this. Hello, I would like to speak to Paul Cashmere, please. And I said, that's me. And he goes, oh, hello, my name is George Harrison. I'm ringing from London in England. It was just such a formal thing. It was just fantastic. Then he goes, now the first thing I have to ask you before we start this interview, are you involved with anything to do with Rupert Murdoch? And I said, no, not at all. And he goes, good, then we can proceed. For the next 40 minutes, I had George Harrison all to myself for what was just a marvellous interview. In that interview, he talked about the anthology for the very first time, and there were things in there that he had never said before to hear repeated on CNN on the day that he died, where they were quoting lines from that interview, was just remarkable. So that one's right up the top. You know, I've been very privileged to, like, when I look at, you know, my top 10 favourite artists, I'd probably hit the mark on all of them in there. There's been a Beatle, there's been a Stone with Mick Jagger, Robert Plant, Ozzy Osbourne, the Kinks, the Who. They've all been in there. And then, you know, more recently, you know, when you take it right through to people like Alice Cooper, Dave Grohl, Pearl Jam, you know, I've been very, very lucky over a very long period of time to talk to some very wonderful people.
The worst interviews, the ones that didn't go so well?
I had a really bad interview with Warren Zevon. Warren Zevon was in Australia. I've actually recently gone back to have a look at the venues he was playing, and he was playing in things like Grain Store Tavern and these tiny little venues that, you know, if you walked into any of these venues today and somebody like Warren Zevon was performing there, your jaw would drop. But that was the sort of places he was put into. I was given him, he's obviously arrived into Australia, very unhappy with the venues he's found, and he just didn't want to do the interview. So I had a really bad time with him. Another bad one that I had was a Chris Rea interview at one point where basically he just told me right from the start he didn't want to talk about his music. And it was like, well, then what are we going to be talking about? And he says, well, you know, my lyrics tell it all, so we don't need to talk about that. It's like, oh, yes, we do. But that one wasn't going to change. And I also had a very bad interview back at the day with Joan Trading, and you know, for decades I carried that with me until recently, her most recent album that came out over the COVID period, and got to get her on Zoom and talk to her face to face again, and she was absolutely lovely. So, you know, I think when you have a bad interview with some people, sometimes it could just be that day. You don't know what mood people are in. You don't know the circumstance for why they might be in that bad mood. And I think, you know, as media people, we've just got to suck it up and just, you know, take the day as it comes.
Yeah. You own your own media company now, but have you felt that you've had editorial freedom in most of the work you've had done?
Pretty much. I mean, one of the great things about the music industry is that when you work in bigger entertainment companies, they really don't care about the music industry. So, you know, when I'm working in radio, whether it be the Macquarie network or the Austereo network, you kind of get left alone because they're too busy concentrating on, you know, what their breakfast stars are saying for the morning. So you get a lot of freedom, I think, in working in traditional media for things like that. And then when I went into public companies, well, you know, I was in a much more senior position in that, where I was making decisions. So I've never really been in a situation where I've been dictated to by bosses, which has been a great learning curve for me, because it's given me the chance to develop and make all the mistakes by myself. So whenever I've made a mistake, I've only had myself to blame. And while that hurts in the short term, it's a very good learning lesson in the long term.
You can be quite outspoken with your commentary. Ever had any legal issues?
I think legally you're always going to have disagreements, and people are always going to think that they're right with anything that you come out and say that they might not agree with. So yes, there have been a couple of legal letters along the way. One being a very, very weird one that came from the lawyers for Yoko Ono, because they didn't like the wording of a particular story, and why they would be bothering chasing somebody on the other side of the planet, I do not know. I do remember another time where I was threatened with legal action over a Rolling Stones story, because I'd reported that Charlie Watts had left the band. And that led to a public statement coming out from somebody within their camp to say that we have no idea who this guy is or what he's saying or why he's saying it, but it's not true. And again, I'm thinking somebody on the other side of Australia, the other side of the world, coming out and saying something. Why do you need to come out and say that it's wrong? You just let that one slide. Another one had to do with an Australian band who I won't name. I was at South by Southwest in Texas, walking down the street and saw a very big name in the entertainment industry who I believed had recently signed this band and then unsigned them. And then I walked up to him and said, I hear that you're now not taking insert Australian band here. And he said, "Oh, I just cannot work with that woman." And that, to me, seemed like a pretty good story to have. So we went with the story, and then he turned around and wanted to sue us over that. I just said to his lawyers, I'm happy to stand up in court and say what he said. If you want that to happen, bring it on. And that one was extinguished very, very quickly based on that.
What do you think of the state of music media currently?
The state of music media is pretty sad and sorry. There's very few of the old school people who understand that an artist has a story and sets out to tell the story. You see a lot of music media that's all about clickbait, and we have a lot of clickbait artists that don't have any real depth whatsoever because they've been manufactured in the studio. We see that particularly with the Max Martin school of songwriting, where you've got this faceless person on the other side of the desk just churning out songs like they're donuts every day and then adding a different artist around it. And you've got a very similar style of sound that is coming out of things like that. So we are seeing a lot of media that when you're younger, I don't want to come across as the old guy here, but we as old guys had a lot more standards than the standards that are out there today. There was a lot more fact checking, there was a lot more research. I don't see a lot of that going into the interviews of the younger artists, and a lot of the younger artists really don't have stories anyway because they're all put together in the cookie machine. So the state of media is interesting. The music reviewer, the articulate music interviewer, storyteller, are few and far between, unfortunately, now.
What about pet peeves from artists, publicists, labels seeking an interview or content? What are the things that won't get them coverage? A lot of the PR that comes through is just, let's see how much shit we can put up against the wall and see who takes it. Once upon a time, we would get a phone call every day, or you get 10 phone calls in a day from 10 different publicists who were also involved in the music industry, knew the music industry, loved the artists they worked with, or if they didn't at least love the artists, respected the artists they worked with, but could articulate who that artist was and the audience that they wanted to appeal to. And there was filtering that was done at that level before it ever got to the media. But right now, I'm seeing that it doesn't matter who the artist is with some PR people.
and you know, like I cover a specific demographic, which tends to be an older demographic or 40 plus demographic. It tends to be real musicians, and it tends to be more of the rock, pop, blues, jazz area, as opposed to the sausage machine pop star that is coming out at the other end. And to still be presented those people because they want to do interviews or they want stories run, I just see as lazy PR, and that's probably my biggest pet peeve with what is happening there at the moment. But you know, it comes through as a email, and generally never gets followed up. So you know, I give it the attention it deserves.
What about advice to young artists leading up to an interview? What kind of preparation can they do to help create a good interview?
When you have a group together, say you've got 2, 3, 4 people that are going to be in on the interview together, nominate who's going to be generally the spokesperson for that, or even it out so it goes up and down, so you're not left with a question being fired at a band and everybody looking at each other not knowing how to answer it. If you're being interviewed by a number of people over a day, as generally would be happening in the course of a press call, make sure that you have your own story. People are going to be asking you about your history, they're going to be asking you about your music, they're going to be asking you about the people that are involved with your music, and just make sure you just do a little common courtesy and do your own research about yourself. The number of artists that really can't articulate their own story is unbelievable. So you know, the media need to present a story to the audience, so give them a story.
Any regret interviews, ones that got away?
Ones that I haven't done that I would like to do over the course of the rest of my life. I can't really put a timeline on the rest of my life, so I've not talked to Madonna, although I would not think that talking to Madonna would be a great interview anymore. That probably sailed around the mid-90s after, or probably early 2000s, around the time of the music record. I never got to talk to Kurt Cobain. I would have loved to have talked to him when he came to Melbourne that time, but I did get to talk to Dave Grohl later. But Kurt Cobain would have been a great one. I mean, of course, we've always had that level of artists that you would like to get to over the years, but I've never had a chance to get to. Never done a Bruce Springsteen, but I've done a Billy Joel. So you know, I've probably had more than my fair share. If I had to have a wish list, I've pretty much got most of my wish list covered.
Paul Cashmere, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Greg.